We are extremely pleased that so many of you came back for the second session of our Centennial Symposium here at Augsburg College. And we welcome all of you to this session and invite you to return this evening for the final lecture given to the public in this auditorium at 8:30 by Dr. Malik. Our speaker at this session of our symposium on world starvation disaster in the 70s needs an introduction. Not because he is unknown as a person, but because I do not believe this audience knows what it should know about him. You should know our speaker as a scholar. Educated in his native Lebanon, he received his PhD degree from Harvard University in 1937. Since 1927, he has been associated with the University of Beirut and has served as its Dean of Graduate Studies, and since 1962 has been a distinguished professor of philosophy at that university. He has served also on the faculties at Harvard, Dartmouth, and American universities. He is the author of several volumes: War and Peace in 1950, Problems of Asia, 1951, Problems of Coexistence, 1955, Christ and Crises, 1962, and Man in the Struggle for Peace, 1963. He has contributed parts of many other books and authored numerous articles in American, European, and Near Eastern magazines. At least, and I say at least because I don't know the latest count, 41 colleges and universities around the world have awarded him honorary doctorates. He is a member of more learned societies than time will allow to report. You should know our speaker as a statesman and diplomat. Here again we must condense. He was the Republic of Lebanon's first minister to the United States, a signator for Lebanon of the United Nations Charter and of the Japanese Peace Treaty, a member and sometime chairman of the Lebanese delegation to the United Nations, and chairman of the 13th, or rather president of the 13th session of the UN General Assembly, a member of the UN Security Council and has served as its president, a member of the UN Human Rights Commission and its chairman at one time. He helped to draft the UN Covenants on Human Rights, was a representative of Lebanon to the International Bank Fund and UNESCO, and was a delegate to the Bandung Conference in 1955. He has been Minister of Foreign Affairs for Lebanon, Minister of National Education and Fine Arts, and a member of the Lebanese Parliament. At least 13 nations have honored him with their decorations. You should know our speaker also as a profound Christian, a church statesman, and a spiritual leader. He is without doubt the greatest lay spokesman for the Orthodox Church in the world today, and has played a leading role in the rapprochement between Roman Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. For many years he has been closely associated with the ecumenical movement and the development of the World Council of Churches. He is a vice president of the United Bible Societies. His Christian convictions are always evident. Time magazine wrote, "He is probably the only foreign minister who ever urged Westerners to love the people of the Middle East as the basis of their foreign relations." Augsburg College is greatly honored to have Dr. Charles Malik of Lebanon as a participant in this symposium, and I am pleased to present him to this audience to speak on the subject, the economic and political responsibilities of the West. Dr. Malik.
Thank you very much. President Anderson, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we saw the graphs and charts, and we know the statistics. The population of the world doubled between 1850 and 1925. and by 1980 it will have doubled again. Namely, it will be 4 billion people. So that in 4 generations, from 1850 to 1980, it will have quadrupled. Under the present rate of increase, in less than a century and a half from now, the population carrying capacity of the globe would be absolutely exhausted. In 2.5 centuries, the population of the world would rise to 500 billion people. And in about 7 centuries, always at the present rate of increase, there would be 1 person for every square foot of land surface on the globe, just enough room in desert, plain and mountain for each one of us to remain standing on our feet all our lives. What a cheerful prospect. The ultimate cause of this fantastic development is science, and its consequences, political, social, economic, cultural, intellectual, human, and spiritual, are all too clearly imaginable. All this we know very well. But what we do not know is what to do about it. How to bring this incredible explosion under rational human control. This is the picture in the gross. When we break it down into its components, interesting facts begin to appear. The fastest growing populations are the non-Western peoples. There is plenty of time for some countries, for example Canada, the United States, Brazil, Argentina, the Soviet Union, and Australia. There is plenty of time for these countries before they begin to feel the pinch of the population pressure. For other countries, however, for example, India, China, Egypt, Central America, and some countries in Western Europe, the pinch threatens in a matter of years. And indeed for some, such as India and Egypt, the pinch is already upon them. Under the present rates of increase, at the end of this century, the total population of the world, which is today 3.5 billion, will be 7.5 billion people. The population of mainland China at the end of the century, which is today 750 million, will be 1.5 billion. And the population of India, which is now 1/2 billion, will be 1.2 billion people. Still another way of breaking down the gross picture is the following. Presently, there are nations whose populations are increasing rapidly. These are principally in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And there are nations whose populations are increasing slowly. These comprise chiefly North America and Europe, including Russia. There are few underdeveloped nations in the intermediate ranges. This demographic polarization has the most serious implications for the underdeveloped peoples. Poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, social retardation, and political instability are clustered together in the countries with high birth rates. High incomes, abundant vitality, increasing professional and technical manpower, rapid social advance, and general political stability are clustered together in the countries with low or relatively low birth rates. Population growth compounds the difficulties of peoples whose modernization lies in the future. The ancient ways of living preserve the high rates of growth. Poverty perpetuates the conditions that preserve poverty. Population growth perpetuates the conditions that lead to population growth. In my two talks today, this morning and in the evening, I am not going into any great factual detail beyond what I have just said. Such detail has already been put before you in this symposium. I assume a general acquaintance with the available literature, which is becoming immense, on the subject of famine as a result of the population explosion. Experts differ. This is an important point. Experts differ on many important matters, and I am not competent to decide among their differences. However, it is clear that for many areas, the population explosion is a fact. It is also clear that the far-reaching consequences of this explosion for these areas, as well as for world peace, are more or less clearly surmisable. And therefore, on the knowledge of the certain fact, and its probable consequences, one can make a few fundamental observations on the ultimate responsibilities of the West and of the peoples concerned vis-à-vis this momentous phenomenon. I therefore assume the truth of the following statement made by a former advisor to the government of India, Mr. Raymond Ewell, and here I quote from him. The world is on the threshold of the biggest famine in history. If present trends continue, it seems likely that famine will reach serious proportions in India, Pakistan, and China in the early 1970s. Latin America will fall in this category by 1980. Such a famine will be of massive proportions, affecting hundreds of millions, possibly billions of persons. This is the end of this quotation, and I assume its truth. I also assume the truth of the following statement made by Mr. Sen, the distinguished Director General of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Mr. Sen says, either we take the fullest measures both to raise productivity and to stabilize population growth, or we face a disaster of unprecedented magnitude. Problems of hunger and malnutrition, which afflict more than a half of the world's population, pose a serious threat to peace. That's the end of the quotation from the Director General of the FAO. Finally, I assume the truth of the following conclusion, reached by the 1965 White House Conference on International Cooperation. And here I quote, the rate of growth of world population is so great and its consequences so grave that this may be the last generation which has the opportunity to cope with the problem on the basis of free choice. Economic assistance, including the supply of foodstuffs, has become, since World War II, the regular feature of the foreign policy of the more industrialized nations, including Russia and Eastern Europe. Just as it has for centuries been taken for granted that friendly nations exchange ambassadors between themselves, so it is now a normal thing for a more developed nation to include in the pattern of its relations with the less developed nations a measure of technical and economic assistance. Just as you talk to a friend and smile to him, so part of your intercourse with him today, if he is in need, is actually to help him. This has spread all over the world, so that some of the erstwhile receiving nations are now lending such assistance themselves. As a matter of history, it happens that I was the first person at the United Nations to urge such a policy upon the more developed nations, both through the United Nations and bilaterally. When, in December 1946, a little more than 20 years ago, I introduced at Lake Success a draft on this subject, which was later adopted by the General Assembly as the United Nations' first resolution in the field of technical and economic assistance. The more advanced countries called me a visionary and an idealist, and some of them applied even less savory epithets, while the newly emergent nations affected to see in my proposal a premature nostalgia for the re-establishment of imperialism. But I stuck to my convictions in the teeth of much ridicule and opposition, and as I said, the first United Nations resolution on this field was finally adopted in December 1946. One can easily adduce the necessities for such a new departure in international relations. Economic necessities, political necessities, and necessities from the point of view of human solidarity and international peace. It is an investment, as it has been called, in mutual security. The United States alone has extended, since the Second World War, assistance of all kinds, including the Marshall Plan, of the order of $150 billion, virtually to every nation in the world. And if you add up all foreign assistance figures by all nations during this period, it will probably amount to $200 billion. Under the American Food for Peace Law of 1954, already more than $13 billion worth of food products have been sent to other countries. India alone is receiving now more than 20,000 tons of wheat a day from this country. And yet, even if America were to step up this program on a vast scale until American farmlands were exhausted, America still could not feed the burgeoning millions of the world's population. As President Johnson himself put it in his 1966 foreign aid message to Congress, he said, we cannot meet the world food needs of the future, however willing we are to share our abundance, nor would it serve the common interest if we could. That's the end of the quotation. Namely, it is not good and healthy for the United States to be a permanent benefactor, nor is it good and healthy for the recipient nations to be permanent beneficiaries. And so it is of the utmost importance that supplementary programs be developed. On top of the United States, the Soviet Union, Canada, Australia, Argentina, and France, intensively cultivating their agricultural resources and helping thereby the hungry peoples. On top of all that, the native land resources of these peoples themselves must be more scientifically developed. Although there are great possibilities here, one must also reckon with great obstacles. Only a very small fraction of the earth's total surface is fit for cultivation. Not all lands, my friends, are as fortunate from the point of view of natural fertility as the soil of America or Canada or France. What is fit for cultivation of the earth's surface is not more than 8% of the whole surface of the earth. There are difficulties here stemming from scarcity of capital, from cultural and scientific deficiency on the part of the populations concerned, from the climate, and from other factors. But even the most intensive scientific cultivation of all cultivable land on the earth's surface will not be enough to provide food for the hungry mouths in the future which are increasing at a geometrical rate. There is, of course, hope in industrialization, and people are pinning their hope on that. In fact, everybody today is attempting to industrialize. But here again, there are limits. First, scarcity of capital. Second, there are not enough savings for capital investment in these countries. And third, scientific culture, without which industrialization is impossible, takes several generations to root itself in the native soil. But industrialization is a distinct source of hope, and it will have to be exploited to the utmost, both to increase a people's productivity in general and to work out new synthetic food products. The ocean is another source of food. There is plenty of organic foodstuffs in the seas, both animal and vegetable, to feed the world's population many times over. And therefore, the oceans are a great field for exploitation in the future. The only question is the economic feasibility of this process. Can it be produced cheaply and abundantly enough? Can it cope with the challenges of the population increase? If all the scientific and technological know-how in the world were mobilized for the exploitation of the oceans, miracles may be achieved. But there are, alas, other demands on these technological and scientific resources. In the long run, however, the oceans are a tremendous source of supply of food, yet insufficiently tapped. Only yesterday, President Johnson told Congress he had begun a new program to explore the seas and to reap their treasures. In his message, the President says, and here I quote, "The resources of the oceans can help us meet many of the challenges that face our nation and the world today. The vast food reserves of the sea must be developed to help end the tragic cycle of famine and despair." Another such source is the Saharas and the deserts. Desalination of salt water, of sea water, on a vast scale by the utilization of nuclear energy in such a way that whole deserts will be irrigated, this is the real breakthrough of the future. Imagine with me 20 Mississippis, 20 artificially created, flowing from the Mediterranean and the Atlantic into the Saharas and deserts of Africa and the Middle East. This may appear to you a fantastic prospect, but it is theoretically feasible. Then you will be able to produce enough food for 50 times the present population of the world. But again, the problem is not theoretical feasibility, but economic feasibility. I believe in 500 years from now, this picture will come true. But alas, the demographic crisis is upon us long before then. The race, therefore, is between the intellectual creativity of man and man's reproductive fertility. But the ocean and the desert, these two are the long-range hopes of mankind. Either then you let man reproduce himself without limit and do the best you can by natural and technological means to feed the geometrically rising populations with the certainty of famine, hunger, starvation, and enormous social and political upheavals and dislocations as a result. Either this, or you tailor man's reproductive fecundity to man's economic capability to feed the billions he will thus be reproducing. The latter alternative, namely the tailoring of the reproductive fecundity to man's economic capacity, this latter alternative means birth control. I believe this is the only answer. The only answer. And therefore the question of how to bring about birth control, or by whatever other term you may call it, and they use all kinds of other euphemisms for it, having regard to the human, social, religious, and personal scruples and problems involved, is the most crucial question. Either inevitable famine and disorder on a vast scale in many areas of the world very soon, and in all areas sooner or later, or planned, deliberate, rational, religiously sound birth control. I shall not enter into the methods of bringing about the control of man's reproductive potency, because these raise valid, technical, and medical and religious questions which require greater competence than I commend. But man must do something to stabilize and limit his fantastic reproductive capabilities. Three questions here at once arise. First, can the fast increasing peoples and cultures develop themselves fast enough to cope with their subsistence and higher than subsistence needs? Second, is there enough peace, trust, agreement among the more advanced peoples, I mean Russia, Europe, and America, to enable them to divert more of their productive resources to help the nations with fast increasing populations, both to feed their peoples and to raise their standards of living? The whole thing then is clearly a function of peace and concord among the more advanced, the more industrialized nations. And third, you cannot keep on feeding and clothing people who appear bent on not taking adequate care of themselves, and who besides develop hostile sentiments. The strong can afford to be magnanimous and far-seeing, but there are limits even to the magnanimity of the strong. There are limits to everything in life. This is the first rule of wisdom. Thus, even if there were no material limits, which we saw there were, there are distinct philosophical and political limits to how much the West can be responsible for helping these peoples. Economic responsibilities are themselves functions of other responsibilities. There must be response and vitality in the other dimensions for economic aid to be effective and fruitful. Economic aid alone does not make the people aided mature, responsible, friendly, cooperative, self-reliant, creative. The fundamental dimension of human response, the fundamental dimensions of human response are independent. It is only as people respond independently in the other dimensions that the dimension of economic aid can bear fruit. Otherwise, it is like pouring water into a rat hole. But this means that we should consider the higher responsibilities, of which I turn now to the political. The political responsibilities on the part both of the West and the countries of fast-growing populations are far more important than the sheer economic responsibilities. Only people who are politically conscious and responsible can be conscious economically and responsible economically. We are focusing this morning on the problems which arise from the population explosion. And at this point we ask, what are the political responsibilities of the West and the countries concerned with regard to these problems? The West must coordinate its efforts in facing this problem. There is some coordination among Europeans, some between Europe and America, and at the United Nations some between the two and Russia, but not enough. The problem is of such staggering magnitudes that sooner or later much greater coordination will have to be worked out. The West must induce, it must induce, I almost said by hook or crook, but I'll put it slightly differently. I'll say the West must induce through the gentle art of diplomacy and in other ways, better and more responsible governments in these countries. The West must induce, through the gentle art of diplomacy and in other ways, better and more responsible governments in these countries. When you know that developments in your neighbor's house affect you directly, you cannot sit back and disinterest yourself in them. You are in fact intensely, faithfully, incurably interested in the kind of regimes that reign, in the kind of political leadership that emerges. The only honest, non-hypocritical question is how fruitfully, constructively, to give effect to your interest. The West cannot watch explosive demographic situations developing without doing what it can to see that a responsible political leadership arises that will take full responsibility for them. There is the problem of cultural and political self-defense. Cultures, civilizations, nations have every right to take necessary measures in self-defense against the encroachment of the alien and different, not to speak of the envious and ambitious. It is quite true there is plenty of space in Russia, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, and in South America to absorb billions of the rapidly increasing populations of China, India, Pakistan, and other countries. This is quite true. There's plenty of space. But this is abstract arithmetical thinking. The countries with plenty of space happen to be inhabited by peoples who are intensely politically and culturally self-conscious. They have strict laws regulating the entry of alien peoples into their territories. Any large-scale immigration will produce not only vast economic distortions and dislocations, but political, cultural, and spiritual chaos. This is the philosophical meaning of the system of nation-states which characterizes the international order of this epoch. The Russian mind, for example, does not relish the prospect of being diluted or dominated by 300 million Chinese spilling over from across its border, nor the American mind by 200 million Indians coming over here, nor the Canadian mind by 50 million Pakistanis migrating to Canada. Nor will such cultural and political promiscuity really solve the problem. For in the first place, the depression in the quality and strength of the Russian, American, and Canadian cultures, which will result from such promiscuous mingling, will considerably weaken these peoples industrially and spiritually, and their very ability to help China, India, and Pakistan to overcome the problems arising from their population explosion will thus be impaired. And in the second place, no sooner have the first hundreds of millions spilled over then new hundreds of millions will be reproduced to follow upon their heels. There is then inherent, natural justice in the protective measures taken against unlimited migration. Not only is migration now strictly controlled, so that any considerable overflow can only take place through an act of aggression, and there is adequate protection against such an act, both by the international order and by the inherent right of self-defense. But there is another cultural defense mechanism which automatically sets in. Dominant cultures can assimilate alien elements only in small doses. And people are usually unhappy for 1 or 2 generations when they migrate. People on the whole prefer not to migrate. They accept uprooting themselves only under unbearable pressure. The Chinese are happy in China, the Indians in India, the Egyptians in Egypt. And it is these peoples who are happy in their own homes who are really not desirous to leave them, who are hit most by the population explosion. Cultural mechanisms, even apart from political restrictions, tend therefore to throw cultural groupings on their own resources. They are forced to explore internal ways and means for coping with the problem. They must sweat it out internally. In the good sense of the term, they must, so far as this problem is concerned, stew in their own juice. This stewing, however, would inevitably have international repercussions. And this fact, even apart from humanitarian, not to speak of more exalted considerations, imposes upon the more fortunate nations, the so-called haves, such as America, special obligations. While keeping the burgeoning populations at bay, while helping to prevent the commission of acts of aggression and stopping the spilling over of surplus populations onto their own proper domains, and while taking advantage of the operation of the automatic cultural mechanism to which I referred, they must nevertheless, through international action and direct friendly diplomacy, help the countries with rapid population growth meet the almost superhuman challenges which face them. There is here no mechanical rule. There is no certainty of success in every case. There will always be upheavals in many countries as a result of internal population pressures, upheavals that may at best be only controlled or regulated or isolated by outside assistance and watchfulness. Until whole cultures become politically mature and politically responsible, until the notion of the common good, incarnating itself internally in rational justice and externally in peace and the rule of law, has seeped deep into the soul of whole cultures, expressing itself in laws and customs, in literature and song, in the whole apparatus of a people's unconscious and instinctive thinking, until the leaders whom the people throw up and accept are themselves responsible nationally and internationally. Until all this happens, population growth is going to give rise to terrific tensions, upheavals, wars, revolutions, and death by famine, by war, and by pestilence of millions of people. Until all this happens, and in the meantime, the responsibilities of the West are clear: to be understanding and patient, to exercise maximum foresight and vigilance, to be firm in its policy and sure of its grounds, not to allow the edge of quantity to overwhelm the edge of quality, to make sure and be absolutely self-conscious of its own values, to take every legitimate defensive precaution, to learn the virtue of depth. The serpent is deep. Never to weary from teaching, challenging, provoking, pointing out, to rub in, day in and day out, the lesson of responsibility, to harp, day in and day out, on respect for international law, to be as helpful as possible within the limits of depth, mutual dignity, and self-defense, and to wait confidently until people learn from their own mistakes and the hard knocks of experience, or until God in His own mercy grants them by a special dispensation of His own the grace of learning without going through the tragedies of existence and the crucible of suffering. Of course, the West is his brother's keeper. Of course, the West should be the good steward. Of course, the West should be a sort of good Samaritan. Of course, from him who is blessed with much, much will be required. But this is not the only spiritual rule. There is such a thing as being frivolous and sentimental. Such a thing as not knowing one's own values and therefore squandering them. There is such a thing as not humbly believing in these values and standing up for them, and therefore as not being worthy of them. The West should be on its guard with respect to committing sacrilege against its own supreme values, just as much as it should be on its guard with respect to developing a hardness of heart towards its brother and a callousness to his needs. When you come to help me, I have every right, after duly thanking you, to put this question to you, whether openly or between me and myself in secret. Who are you? What are you on top of your helpfulness? Why are you helping me? In whose name are you helping me? And you are certainly under the responsibility and the obligation to answer these questions, whether openly to me or between me and yourself in secret. Never deceive yourself into believing that you are under no obligation to give an account of yourself. that your helpfulness and generosity themselves relieve you of the necessity of giving an account of yourself, that you so dazzle people by your helpfulness that there is no need for you then to give an account of yourself, that people then will simply shut up and ask you nothing. I beg you never to deceive yourselves into believing that. The more you help, the more people are curious as to why you help. The more you extend a hand, the more people wonder about the motive. The more you are in a position to help, the more people wonder how it came about that you are in a position to help. So please, tell them simply, humbly, and with purity of heart. I hope you know why. I hope when you tell them, they will not only thank you for your help, but they will thank God for you. And so we see that the economic and political responsibilities of the West, great and real and unavoidable as they are, nevertheless only flow from much deeper responsibilities. To these I shall turn in the evening.
Your response indicates that you have been inspired by Dr. Malik's address, but I know also that you have been provoked to thinking. And we are going to give this group an opportunity in the next 10 or 12 minutes to have the benefit of Dr. Malik's answers to some of your questions. And so I'm going to ask you, if possible, to remain for these moments, and if you have a question, to put it on the card that was given to you when you came in, and the ushers will quickly gather these. I think we ought to get a few of them up here right now. If there's anybody with a card with a question, will you hold it up and we'll get the usher to get it immediately.
To me, that it is a fair bargain to agree with each other that just as I give you full freedom to put questions to me in any way you like, you will grant me by the same token full freedom to answer you in any way I like. I haven't read these things, so I haven't the vaguest idea what there is in them. But I am certainly prepared for the worst, and also I beg you also to be prepared for the worst from me. Question. The various proposals for aiding the underdeveloped or overpopulated nations frequently involve aid from the United States. Yet it has been said that her first responsibility is to her own economy, its problems, and stability. This is true, perfectly true. First responsibility is to itself. Then it happens that first it has an abundance of these things, and secondly, it cannot close its eyes to what's happening elsewhere, because this is a closely knit world today, and what happens elsewhere can easily involve you in due course in all kinds of unpleasant consequences. So you better be far-seeing and do something about it in advance. But it's quite true that the responsibilities of the United States are first to its own economy. Second question. Would our agricultural negotiations at Geneva improve if we were more willing to provide food aid through the United Nations? This raises the problem of the place of the United Nations in this whole scheme. it has a real place, and it has not been fully exploited. But again, the United Nations, because of all kinds of reasons, principally reasons of differences in the international order, may not be always the best means of helping other people. But I believe that the United Nations is a real means, and that means should be exploited further. Another question. Do you anticipate increasing world disorders with possible destruction of democracy, aided by need for a world authority to plan the selection of cultural domination by birth control? The second part is not very clear. Aided by need for a world authority to plan the selection of cultural domination by birth control. Well, whatever I understand of this question, if it means that if democracy is destroyed, then there will be world disorder, it does not necessarily follow. But the question is whether disorder is the highest value, whether you would not prefer democracy with disorder than perfect order without democracy. I prefer the first. So I'm not prepared to buy freedom, to sell freedom. I'm not prepared to sell freedom and man and democracy and human rights only for the sake of maintaining order. Order is a great value, but it's not the highest value. Sometimes it's good to have some disorder. It shakes people out of their own lethargies. Another question. It was your opinion that we must induce and ensure responsible governments in undeveloped nations. Do you feel that authoritarian forms of government are best equipped to meet the responsibility of averting mass starvation in these countries? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. I do not believe that there is a special virtue that for authoritarian governments to do this job better than governments with some degree of freedom. It seems fashionable today that people would be prepared to sacrifice anything, including freedom, including democracy, including anything, provided there is what they call peace and order and stability, and nobody is bothering anybody, and nobody is having any headaches from his neighbors. I think this is a low ideal. I think there is a higher ideal than mere stability and mere order and mere peace. The higher ideal is the dynamic, dangerous pursuit of man's highest nature, which certainly must include his freedom and his decency and his reason. So I place order and peace and stability at a lower level in the scale of values than that of man and democracy and freedom. Minnesota is the food capital of the world. This is an excellent propaganda. What can we as a state or region do specifically to contribute to a solution? Well, produce more food and better food, and don't throw away much food after you eat in your meals, because I'm told that there is enough food that the amount of food thrown away in the United States every day could easily feed the whole of Africa. I think it's an exaggeration, but people say that. So there is a certain amount of waste that's going on. I suppose that's the best you can do, and also follow the policies that are worked out by your responsible representatives in Washington. Do you think that there is an advantage in the United States giving economic aid through the United Nations as compared with bilateral aid? I tried to answer this before. Yes, there is a real advantage, but it should not be exaggerated. The United Nations has its own limitations, limitations of efficiency and limitations of political squabbling. And while it should be fully exploited, one cannot wholly depend on the United Nations. What are our political responsibilities in Vietnam? Well, somewhere Vietnam must come up, and I suppose it came up here. I do not want at this point to venture an opinion about the Vietnam situation. I have certainly my own views of it, but I trust the good sense of the American people and the good sense of their leaders in developing their own policies in that country. Rather than spend billions of exploration of space, should it not be spent on exploration of oceans and deserts as sources of food supply? Well, other things being equal, yes. But unfortunately, other things are not equal. It is always a matter of priorities in these things. If you ask the people responsible for the allocation of funds in Washington, they act under the strictest system of priorities. And a problem arises or a crisis arises, and a certain amount of money must be diverted in that direction. Now, about space exploration, it appears to me that both technologically and from the point of view of the posture of America in the world, and also militarily, for all these three reasons. Reasons of posture and image in the world, and reasons of technological development, and reasons of military necessity. It appears to me that the United States cannot lag in its space exploration. And therefore I think there is a real top priority to allocating lots of money in that direction. If that money could be released, then of course it would be turned to the exploration of oceans and deserts. In the long run, 200, 500 years from now, the oceans and the deserts will certainly come to their own. How has the Israeli experiment of making the Negev agriculturally productive affected the food problem of the Middle East? I don't think it has affected it at all. I don't think people in the Middle East are aware of this, outside Israel, are aware of this development, nor do I think there is surplus food that can flow out of Israel to the countries of the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Our deepest appreciation to Dr. Malik for his address, for his willingness to answer these questions, and we look forward with keen anticipation to his address this evening. The many questions that yet remain to be answered indicate the success of this symposium. It simply means that there's going to be a lot of discussion going on after the formal symposium is over. Our guests are invited to stop for coffee and to meet Dr. Malik following this session. This session is adjourned. Thank you.